Under the white heat of a Coronado morning, the firing range lay like a strip of truth cut into the coastal scrub, its berms and steel silhouettes catching sunlight and wind with equal indifference. Men moved across it with the velocity of ritual, boots stamping out tempo, eyes fixed on targets and pride, the air tasting of salt and gunpowder and impatience. The new class of SEAL sniper candidates had arrived at that hour for a final test they had been promised would define them, a capstone meant to separate those who read wind and time from those who only read specs on a screen. They were young, taut with muscles and too many quiet certainties, lean jawlines, sun-creased skin, the practiced swagger of men who had already been told how they would end up in the stories, at the center. They traded jokes like talismans and wrapped themselves in bravado as if it were armor. One of them, Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, moved through that group as if a kingdom had been prearranged around his confidence. Tall, chiseled, voice trained to carry over others, he took leadership with the casual cruelty of someone who had mistaken confidence for competence. He liked the sound of his own pronouncements and performed them as if the range were a stage and his voice the only authorized script. When a woman in a weathered uniform and a case at the edge of the line lifted the spotting scope, trimmed the tripod, and began methodically checking zeros, a ripple of amusement passed through the group like a low tide, the sort of mockery that arrives before a wave and leaves salt on faces. "Careful, Grandma, try not to drop it," one of them sneered, the words thin armor for the fear they didn't yet understand. Laughter, brittle and sharp, cut the morning light. It came from mouths untested by the long calculus of patience and consequence. The woman's hands moved like someone whose body remembered the exact delirium of recoil and the exact geometry of a calm breath. Nothing she did suggested the need to be loud about what she knew. She took the scope without ceremony, cradled it with the same economy of motion that ordains excellence in any craft, and set it in place. Her face was a map of seasons, graying hair at the temples, lines cut by laughter and weather and long wakeful nights, but the look in her eye was not relic or weakness. It was precise, distilled, and quietly dangerous. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, a broad man with decades written into the slant of his shoulders, watched her from the observation tower and felt a muscle tighten in his chest. He had seen shooters in the dark and the light, men and women who shaped empty air into consequence, and he saw that posture, the small arc of a wrist, the way a foot takes purchase on dirt, that betrays mastery. Where the student saw wrinkles and a uniform that didn't fit perfectly, Miller saw the architecture of an expert. He named the feeling the way sailors named storms, recognition. The mockery sharpened as Lieutenant Thorne stepped forward and turned the moment into a lecture, his words slick with the certainty of the untried. He gestured downrange at the target array, a simulated village bristling with challenges, moving vehicles, rooftop sentries, a figure behind a slatted window, an explosive charge wired to detonate when provoked. He spoke of spin drift and Coriolis and shear as if he were unrolling scripture. He spoke in numbers because numbers were the grammar his peers had been trained to worship. "This isn't something you learn from a book, ma'am," he said, the honorific a sharpened blade of sarcasm. The candidates nodded like worshippers convinced that the altar of data alone could save them. They had digital tools that sang data back in neat numbers, they had kestrels and ballistic calculators and graphs that promised certainty. What they lacked was the old, slow conversation with the wind. They had never felt the sky negotiate with a bullet on a bad day and then learned to bargain with it. Evelyn had been called a clerk by design. She had been assigned to logistics, to the dull and necessary paperwork that the New World often misinterpreted as insignificance, and she had been allowed to be small in their eyes because institutions make cubbyholes for people whose worthers go unappreciated. But she had been young once in a way that politics and appointments could not change. She had been a shooter before she was labeled a signer of forms, and each label had simply been an accumulation of time until one morning the weight of all those forgotten hours broke free. She reached for the Pelican case at the edge of the firing line with hands that, when younger, had become familiar with things that recoil and thunder. Inside was an M210, a heavier, older semi-automatic rifle that the smoke of newer carbon fiber systems had made passé. To Evelyn it was not a museum piece but a familiar companion with its own voice. She assembled it with a quiet ritual, each click of the magazine and snap of the bipod a small musical sentence. The rifle came alive under her hands like an instrument tuned by memory. She did not shove the new digital meters into place or fuss with the screens. Instead, she plucked a single blade of dried grass and held it up between forefinger and thumb, then watched it fall. That blade was as honest as a refusal and as precise as a law. Its fall described to her something a kestrel never could, a microfold in the air where stillness would come and go. She breathed, slow, until her chest was a metronome for her hands, and watched the heat shimmer ripple downrange. There it was, a corridor of calm that shimmered and dissolved in under a heartbeat. In a world of numbers, that corridor was a secret handshake earned by time. She did not blink, she moved as someone whose body remembered how to be patient with the moment, then let it happen. The first shot cracked and seemed smaller than the idea of it, but the next 6 followed in such a staccato that they sounded like the tearing of a single seam, each round finding a precise, necessary metal note. Downrange, the HVT, the high-value target the students had tried and failed to sever, crumpled. The rooftop sentries, the driver, the hidden shooter in the slatted window, each fell to a command the students had not believed they would hear. The final round detonated a mock explosive with a puff of red smoke that sat in the air like a punctuation mark. For a heartbeat the range held its breath, then the clang of shells and the dry, shocked intake of men filled the canyon in a rush. Thorne's face congealed from smirk to gape. Confidence, when unchallenged for long enough, becomes brittle on contact with truth. The colonel walked forward with the even pace of someone who never wasted a gesture, set his eyes on Evelyn, and with a voice that measured both reprimand and honor said simply, "Chief, will you tell them what they just failed at?" The colonel's presence folded the group into a new angle of attention. An ensign fumbled with a tablet, his hands hovered over the screen as if the words themselves might betray him. He read aloud the dry, official bits that life seldom reads aloud: name, rank, Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Reed, 17 combat deployments, assigned, when possible, to Joint Special Operations, awards, some redacted, many decorated with language that casually consumed breath: Silver Star, Bronze Stars with Valor Devices, Distinguished Service Cross. There was a pause, the kind that arrives when a ledger reads as biography rather than bureaucratic shorthand. Standing record for the longest confirmed kinetic strike in a combat zone, the ensign read, his voice smaller than the strength of the words. The range inhaled as a single organism. The idea that someone they had dismissed could carry distances nobody expected, that a woman in weathered fatigues could be the stout center of so many quiet storms, rearranged the ground beneath Thorne's feet. We are taught to measure soldiers by medals and rank. We are less eager to measure them by the long patience of practice and the way silence can be weaponized. The colonel did not look for applause, he did not ask for statements. He simply saluted, then stepped back, and the men around him found themselves responding not in ritual but in an involuntary collection of the body's respect, an attention that fluttered from posture to posture as the enormity of what had been seen filled them. The story traveled in hours across barracks and mess halls, folded into texts and coffee conversations, and by the time the casings had been brushed up from gravel and preserved, the Reed drill had already entered the lexicon, shorthand for a rehearsal in humility, an exercise designed not to embarrass the overconfident but to teach them the long, quiet craft of reading wind and world. Gunnery Sergeant Miller gathered the 7 spent casings and took them back to his workshop where, with the tenderness of someone who recognizes sacrifice, he polished them until they glowed like small suns. He mounted them in a shadow box and inscribed beneath them a simple line: Coronado, competence is silent, respect is earned. The box found its place in the main briefing room, a quiet altar to a day the institution had to remember that arrogance has an expiration date. Lieutenant Thorne would learn more than how to be wrong. He would learn how to be useful. The next morning he stood outside the administrative building at dawn and waited like a supplicant. When Evelyn emerged she looked at him and measured. He shed every performative posture for one honest gesture, a formal apology, an asking to be taught. She agreed, not because she relished retribution but because the purpose of mastery is not private. She told him to be on the range at 0500 and to bring nothing but his ears and attention. Over the following months, the young man who had once been known for his biting commentary became a student of wind and weather. He learned to mark an air's moods by the way grass bent and by the tiny tremor in sunlight, and later in a hostile theater the technique saved his men when he saw the same brief lull that Evelyn had found and took a shot that turned what could have been catastrophe into survival. That success, rendered in the quiet report of one effective round, became anecdote and doctrine. Authority is earned by those who persist in productive humility, it is not conferred by the volume of a voice. The range itself, once a proving ground for ego, became a chapel for the patient and the deliberate. The M210 was retired to a case at the colonel's insistence, not because it had been beaten by newer tech but because it had been the instrument of a lesson. They did not hide it in storage, they placed it where trainees would see it, where the rifle, with its worn wood and dulled metal, would be an explicit counterargument to the cult of novelty. There is a peculiar cruelty in underestimating someone. The world forgives itself for small cruelties by dressing them in jokes and scheduling them as initiation rites. The important thing is what happens after the cruelty is revealed as ignorance, whether institutions correct their rhythm or continue to drum the same cadence. In this case, the institution shifted, the reed drill became a mandatory, dreaded part of the sniper curriculum, a test that required not only marksmanship but humility. It forced students to find the thin corridor of air where a bullet would obey rather than fling itself like a wayward thought. It forced them to learn that the human sensor, patience, intuition, 1,000 quiet hours, sometimes outperforms the digital one. The myth of Evelyn Reed grew not out of spectacle but out of repetition and utility. Doctors of doctrine incorporated her lesson into manuals, and new commanders told the tale with a seriousness that purged laughter from its margins. Thorne, no longer an icon of bluster but a teacher tempered by failure and time, stood years later before a new generation and pointed at the polished casings in their glass box. His voice was not mocking but grave, because he understood the cost of ignorance. He told them that the most dangerous person on any battlefield is the one you dismiss. He told them a story about an unassuming warrant officer who could read the wind like scripture and make a hard world obey. People passed the story on and, over time, it shed details and picked up lessons. The Ghost of Coronado, as the legend named her in the way legends name the unadorned, became shorthand not for a woman's mythical invulnerability but for a standard of excellence that could be taught and learned. A young man sent out on deployment read a copy of the colonel's amended training manual and, when pinned by a hidden sniper in a canyon spun by cruel, unpredictable gusts, remembered how the air looked and the sound of the grass, and he waited for a pocket of stillness the way a man might hold his breath for a last prayer. His one shot unspooled into a miracle of timing and preserved lives. In places where rockets and mortars don't keep good hours, that lesson traveled invisibly between soldiers, an inheritance not of medals but of competence. Years folded into one another and Evelyn eventually retired. She was not lauded with trumpets, she took her leave as she had lived, without spectacle. Her legend, however, did not retire with her. The glass case remained in the hall and the casings kept their soft glow. Recruits learned the story as part of initiation and sometimes, sitting in the cool briefing room, traced fingers near the glass and felt the weight of the lesson. Thorne, who by then wore the weathering of years and the humility of experience, sometimes saw recruits' eyes widen and thought of the searoom he had once filled with ego. He saw that his own arc, from arrogance to taught man, had become useful. He taught not to assert but to enable, not to lead by voice but by example. For many of them the Reed story would be the pivot between adolescent certainty and hardened usefulness. It would be the thing they remembered on a dark night when the instruments failed and they needed to listen rather than compute. The human mind prefers drama, so the mountain of small, quiet corrections often goes unnoticed. A single perfect set of shot screams for notice and becomes shorthand for all the patient work behind it. People told the story in bars and on long drives, in briefings and in whispered moments before sleep. It became a parable for an entire community defined as much by restraint as by action. Some small towns began to call it the day the range learned humility. Others recorded it as doctrine. The echo of that single morning played out in unexpected ways, in a classroom where a teacher found his arrogance corrected, in a young recruit who learned to measure air with a blade of grass, in a commander who altered training to value patience, and in a rifle kept behind glass as a reminder that the most advanced weapon is a practiced mind. By the time Evelyn's hair had silvered further and the world had moved on to newer rifles and digital promises, the lesson she had taught had multiplied quietly into lives saved, mistakes avoided, and men and women who knew how to look before they fired. When you measure a life by its loudness, you miss the ways quietness can be decisive. When you measure a soldier by parade and posture alone, you ignore the other axis of value, the ability to be still until necessary. There are many ways to be brave. one of the truest is to be patient enough to wait until the right instant and then steady enough to act without a tremor. Evelyn Reed's day at Coronado was not only a correction of youthful arrogance, it was a conversion of institutional thinking. It taught that capacity is not the same as noise, and that the loudest voice in the room may be the most unreliable. In the end, the Reed drill and the story that bore her name became more than a tale of a single display of skill. They became a mirror held up to a community that learned to value competence over spectacle. Legends like this have a slow metabolism. They begin in a moment but are sustained by repetition and adoption. They become doctrine when they improve outcomes and become memory when they save lives. Evelyn walked away from the range many times after that morning and never sought to fish for accolades. She took comfort in the knowledge that somewhere, a student might one day hold a blade of grass between thumb and forefinger and know what to look for. The weapon she had used was enshrined not because it was extraordinary but because of what it represented, the triumph of practice over pretense. And in the places where the noise of arrogance faded, the quiet competence remained, a small, steady revolution. For more stories where quiet discipline defeats loud ignorance and where true professionalism is the unassuming hero, subscribe to The Final Watch.